look into Henry Roberts, because when I had met my wife and got introduced to my mother-in-law, she immediately, or very early on, said to me, "Oh, my uncle Henry flew Spitfires in the Second World War and died." And it seemed to me that the family knew so little about him. And in starting the research, I went to see my mother-in-law and said, "Look, I'm going to research Henry." And she handed me this plastic bag. And in the plastic bag were some incredible items, his flying logbook, his diary from 1942. And so that's made the journey of exploring more about Henry so much richer. I've been able to put together more pieces of the jigsaw puzzle than perhaps I wouldn't. But to your point, so Henry was born in September 1919. He was the youngest of 7 children. He and his family lived in Brooklyn, which is about 3 kilometres south of Wellington. He went to the local elementary school there. And then in 1932, he started at Wellington College and was at Wellington College until 1935, when he was 17 years old. He then joined the Railways Board in Wellington. And when the war started, the New Zealand government initially asked for volunteers to join the war effort. I assume not much came out of that. So in July 1940, they set up a ballot, and every month names were drawn out of the list for males between the ages of 18 and 46. And at the end of 1940, Henry's name came out of the ballot.
Hi, everyone. My name's Guy Burke. I learned to fly on my 16th birthday. Cut a long story short, I'm now flying Airbus A330s as a check captain for Qantas. But I've also had ever since a young child, a great interest in World War II aviation, and been very fortunate over the years to have had some great opportunities to fly some of the aircraft. So the aircraft at Berwick, Tiger Moths, Osters and things like that, I first cut my teeth on those sort of aircraft. Then I got involved as a volunteer with a Malcolm Long collection of aircraft. And they had 2 Lockheed Hudsons at the time, Beech 18, Wirraway, and a Windjill, plus Tiger Moth and a few other aircraft. And after a while, after 12 months or so, Malcolm asked if I wanted to start flying the Windjill, which was fantastic. Same time I was flying Decathlon, then onto the Pitt Special, Trojan, Harvard. Started flying her Mustang as well, plus a Vampire. And then when David Lowy set up the Temora Aviation Museum, I was very fortunate to be invited to be part of that. And I have been for the last over 20 years, and the last 2 years with RAAF 100 Squadron. And as David acquired aircraft, I've flown the Lockheed Hudson, both the Spitfires, the Meteor F8 and the Wirraway and Tiger Moth and the Vampire as well. So I've also flown Duty Pace Kitty Hawk. A lot of people ask me what's the best, the Spitfire, Kitty Hawk or Mustang, and it's a very difficult question to answer that one. They're all my favourites in different ways. Each of them have their own areas that they excel in. Best dogfighter without a doubt would be the Spitfire. Slow speed turning aircraft, good power to weight, it'll climb in a turn. But the Mustang, you'll always outrun everyone else in a dive. So you'll always be able to, when you've had enough run for home, and the other 2 wouldn't be able to chase you down. It makes me realise what it was like to fly them in combat and be shot at by, and a lot of these kids are 18, 19, 20. I get to fly them now for fun and just present them to the public. Very gentle on the engines. We keep the G down on the airframes. We just really want to get them airborne and just show children now and generations to come, and we hope to have these flying for the next 100 years or so, what aviation used to be like, and the sacrifices that our military, ex-military and current military have done over the past to give us a quality of life that we now enjoy. John sent me through photos of him, the first one with his with the RNZAF badge on his jumper, and then going through to a very sort of great photo in Malta, which must have been in winter because it got fairly heavy flying kit on, and he's wearing a Sidcot flying suit. The others, be interesting to know who the others are, because I think they're actually, they could be Aussie, because the Aussies had, the RAAF had a very dark tunic, and I think the New Zealanders might have had the same, whereas the RAF had a slightly lighter blue. But in those sort of theatres, there was a bit of mismatch of flying clothing. Like there's a couple of Sidcot flying suits there. Certainly Henry's in one of those, B-Flight or 126 Squadron. Yeah, well, they might be RAF blues there. No, they've got the very early 41 pattern Mae West on, actually, because I collect a lot of this old flying gear too. So when I fly the Spitfire, before it became part of a 100 squadron, and now we're all part of the RAF, so I've got to wear the proper, have bone domes and everything now, but I used to dress up in all the period flying gear, depending on which spit I was flying. And so I'd wear the battle dress, like the guy on the left there. He's got 41 pattern they're called desert boot, flying boots on, and he's got his battle dress 41 pattern Mae West. So, that's typically how I dress up to fly the Spitfire.
So, Steve, can you tell us more about, once he signed up, what sort of flying did he do and on what type of planes?
Henry started with the initial training wing in Leven in April 1941. Because then he moves up to Bell Rock Air Base, which is near New Plymouth, in May 1941. This is the logbook that we're talking about. So in here is the list of every single flight. And you'll see on May 26th, he logs his first ever time in a plane. He was flying NZ-857. Pilot was Flying Officer Armstrong, and he was in a column called Second Pilot, Pupil or Passenger. There's a number of things that they did. He notes down that 1 air experience, cockpit drill, and then effective controls. And that lasted for 15 minutes. So that was the start of his journey to learn how to fly. They were flying to Havilland 82s, which are better known as the Tiger Moths. And he did that all the way through until he eventually graduates in July the 3rd, 1941. He has 3 entries. The first is with Flight Lieutenant Hickson. They've just got it down in the category of test. And then immediately after, again on July the 3rd, he goes up with Flying Officer Armstrong, who's that flying officer that was with him in that very first time that he got into a plane. And he notes that he went out to do aerobatics, rolls and roll-off loop. Immediately after that, he goes up in a Tiger Moth on his own and he does more aerobatics.
Now, Steve, after his initial flight training, Henry would go off to Canada, further twin engine training. Are you able to share with us what this training entailed?
And then on the 17th of July, he note that he left to travel to Auckland. On the 22nd, they board the Dominion Monarch, which was one of the ships that was used during the war to transport young men to various parts of the world. On this particular day, they travelled up through the Panama Canal and eventually ended up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Now, Nova Scotia is some 600 kilometres northeast of Calgary, which is where he eventually was. He was with the Royal Canadian Air Force from September the 1st to November the 7th of, again, 1941, when he moved from the de Havilland, which was a biplane, to the twin-engine Cessna crane. At that particular location, they had the Avro Anson bombers, and then they had the Cessna crane. And Henry ended up logging about 150 hours in addition to doing some simulator-type work.
Yeah, so the American wasn't in the war yet, so it was a Commonwealth thing. That's why they called the crane, because the Yanks call them the Bobcat, Cessna Bobcat. So they were made by Cessna, but the Canadian Air Force bought quite a number. Just like the British called what the Yanks called a Texan, the Harvard. We always call them Harvards, but they don't like the name Harvard. But no, the crane was a twin-engine trainer, basically. So they obviously put him onto that. Normally you would, in Australia anyway, you'd start on Tiger Moths at one of the big elementary flying schools, then you go on to railways, and then from there they would stream you either into fighters or bombers. But he obviously went for New Zealand straight over. And interestingly enough, I would have thought they might have put him on the Harvards if he was already streamed for fighters, but maybe they hadn't categorised him yet. But once they saw him on the crane and realised he was probably a pretty good operator, good pilot, they said, you can go to fighters.
So, Steve, once he finished the training in Canada, they moved across to the UK.
In here on the 6th of November, the chief instructor said Henry was a good sound pilot who had improved greatly with the last 50 flying hours and had no outstanding weaknesses. That he probably ended up in the seaside town of Bournemouth because his next flight wasn't logged until the 28th of January. So over that sort of period through December and early January, he was obviously in transition. And he ended up at the number 2 advanced flying unit of the Royal Air Force at Turnhill in Shropshire near the town of Newport. which is where he started to fly the Miles Master.
If you look at the Miles Master, it was a 2-seat advanced trainer. Yeah, so it either had a Merlin engine or it had a Bristol Peregrine engine, I think, or a Sleevale radial. Yeah, so it was a British 2-seat monoplane advanced trainer designed and built by aviation company Miles. It was inducted in large numbers in both the Royal Air Force and Fleet Air Arm during the Second World War. Yeah, so then he flew that, obviously, and then went on to Spitties after that.
Moved to the Advanced Flying Unit course and was at the number 57 Operational Training Unit in Havilland, which is in Wales, just south of Liverpool. And on the 15th of March 1942, he flies the Spitfire for the very first time. And then he was there for a while before he went on the May the 10th to the Shetland Islands and was flying Spitfires out of the Shetland Islands. Was because the Germans, or the alliance, if you like, the Axis, would come in on the northern side of the UK, because on a number of occasions Henry and other pilots were scrambled to intercept incoming aircraft.
Yeah, he has an engine failure and crash landed at the Shetland Island.
Yeah, exactly. Do you think that's sort of a fairly standard journey for a young man learning to fly?
Yeah, look, at that stage of the war, definitely. Early on, especially in the Battle of Britain, they were desperately short of pilots. So in the UK, they would actually drag guys or pilots out of their operational training unit early if they showed any promise, because they had the aircraft, but they just didn't have the pilots to fly them. So that's why you hear these sort of stories about, this fellow was flying a Spitfire in the Battle of Britain with only 5 hours of flight time. It was probably 5 hours on the Spitfire. Yeah, he might have had 150 hours total, but 5 hours on the Spitfire and then thrown into it. And that's why a lot of them never survived that long, because they pretty quickly worked out statistically, if you survived your first 5 missions, you had a much greater chance of surviving the rest of the time, basically. Because there was always a big situational overload, overload the first time you're in combat, aircraft going everywhere, people firing. You read stories of first time people going into combat, their legs just shaking so much on the rudder pedals, they were so scared, clammy hands and just shaking uncontrollably, because it was basically kill or be killed. And there are people out there firing at you trying to do that. So it's like a knife fight, basically you and him. It took a little while to sort of get through that. And if you look at the film The Battle of Britain, where you see the instructor or the CO take the kids out and he bounces them out of the sun. And he goes, da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and they're just looking around going, where is he? And because they're flying straight for too long and not weaving. But 80% of all aircraft shot down in the Second World War, the actual aircraft being shot down, never saw the person shooting them. So once it turned into a turning fight, it was whoever had the better performing aircraft had the most fuel, because they could just keep turning or keep in the fight rather than having to disengage and run for home, in which case you could be chased down if the other airplane was faster. There's a lot went into it. In fact, some of the highest scoring aces of the Second World War, like Erich Hartmann, who was a German, and he still has a record for the largest number of kills ever, probably never be surpassed, at 352 kills. The Germans were very, and the British as well, were very particular about about awarding kills. Unless there was an independent witness to say, the aircraft you hit went down and crashed, you're only given a damaged or a probable. But there was quite a number of cases where aircraft would be going down in flames, and then someone would come in and give it another burst, so it was on their camera gun, and they say, oh, no, I got that. So there'd be shared kills and things like that. But the Germans were pretty good. But towards the end of the war, they reckon their record keeping was probably not as good. So whether the 352 is totally accurate or not remains to be seen. But even so, he was basically very clinical, a bit like Richthofen. He wouldn't take on other fighters unless he really had to. He was in a situation where he had no choice. He'd go up to the slower up bombers. He'd come in from their blind spots, conserve ammunition, get in really close, shoot them down. And his motto was look, decide, attack or go home. Unless he had the advantage of height or surprise, he'd just go back and wait again for it. He said, my best thing I can do is stay alive and keep shooting down aircraft. I don't need to be a hero. He said, I've flown with a lot better pilots who have gone, there's only 10 of them. I'm going to go shoot them all down, and never came back. He said, the pilot's probably better than him, but he was very calculating and just said, this is my job. I'm here to survive and shoot down aircraft. So there was the gung-ho ones that would couldn't busting for a fight to get in there, and quite often it didn't out in their favour. So he wouldn't engage. And certainly if he was being bounced by Russian fighters, he would get his squad to say, wait. If they open fire early, like really early, he knew they were novices and he'd break into them and have a go. But if they were holding their fire on the way in, he thought, no, these guys know what they're doing. You just break off and go home. It's interesting, so 80% of the kills were what they call a zero deflection shot. So the guy was just flying straight. And the fighter would come up behind and basically just put the aeroplane in the gun sight and fire. Once you're turning, you have to then lay deflection. As soon as the aircraft starts turning in front of you, gun sight's irrelevant because you got it, unless you got a later gyro sight. I will clarify that later. But the old fixed sights, you then basically have to pull the nose ahead of the guy and work out roughly how much deflection that you had to fire, how many sort of lengths of the aircraft ahead you had to fire. And that's why aircraft would, if they were being shot at, would never fly in balance. They'd skid and try and put the aim off of the guy behind so that it was hard to predict the flight path of the aircraft. But the way you get around all that was to get him as close as you possibly could before you fired, because you had less chance of missing the guy. But early on with Henry, he obviously was, I'd say, in 41, they were still very short of pilots, so they would have pushed him through. And obviously they said, right, you've got some ability, we're going to send you off to 132 Squadron. And then he went on from there. So, yeah, as a typical training path, maybe not. Later in the war, the guys would have had at least 250, maybe 300 hours before they got anywhere near a frontline squadron. Because we had saying to John the other day, we had the benefit of the big Empire flight training scheme here in Australia, where we had a number of aerodromes pumping out thousands and thousands of pilots who could train in unrestricted airspace out here without the threat of being shot down. Whereas later in the war in Germany, as they were being closed in on all sides, they had students being shot down in the circuit area by marauding Spitfires and Mustangs looking for them. So they thought if we can shoot the pilots before they get operational, why not? So they'd go and purposely try and shoot down the students while they were learning to fly and strafe their aerodromes and things like that. So the Germans towards the end of the war, their pilot quality dropped off a lot. But you talk to and you read the books of some of the British and Australian pilots who were flying late in the war, and you still never underestimated a German aircraft. You said you might have that one guy who's an ace who will ruin your day very quickly. These guys, a lot of them were kids flying the equivalent, if you like, of the Super Hornet. They were state-of-the-art for their day, these aeroplanes. So they were probably not looked on at the time in the nostalgic, beautiful Spitfire, the sound of a Merlin. To them, it was just a fighting tool to go to war and try and survive and shoot down other aircraft. They obviously were well liked. The lines are really nice, but it's only been with time that they've become such a famous aircraft. And certainly the propaganda during the Second World War and the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire was the morale booster for the British people. That they had the Spitfire, even though it was far fewer numbers than the Hawker Hurricane. In fact, the Hawker Hurricane shot down more aircraft in the Battle of Britain than everything else combined. So that's barrage balloons, ACAC, other fighters. The Hurricanes had a much higher kill ratio, but the Spitfire was the one that got all the glory because it was such a great propaganda tool. But it was also an incredible aircraft that was first flew in March 1936. And it was still being developed right towards the end of the war. So it was one of the first generations of monoplanes to fly after the biplane era. And same with the Messerschmitt 109. The 109 prototype first flew a few months prior to the Spitfire. And Hawker put out the Hurricane, which was essentially a single wing variant of their Hawker Hart, Hawker Demon biplane fighters and bombers of the middle and late 30s. So the Hurricane was pretty much still using a lot of that well-distilled tube fabric covering construction of the biplanes, which made it very strong, but also made it very laborious to make. Whereas the Spitfire was it was basically a thoroughbred. It was designed as an interceptor, so it's designed as a fast climber, very little fuel. So full power in the Mark 1s, you had 45 minutes of fuel. The Mark 1s in the Battle of Britain that had the 8 machine guns, they had about 25 seconds of ammunition, and then they just come straight back down again, quickly rearm, refuel, straight back up. So they're never designed to basically go to another continent to escort bombers. They're never designed with much range in them. So they were an interceptor and a good dogfighter. And they were still a very good dogfighter right up until 1945. There's very few aircraft that could turn with a Spitfire in the right hands, especially the later model variants of the 109s that got heavier and heavier. They put bigger and bigger cannons on them to try and take on the 8th Air Force and the B-17s. Yeah, they were not very good turners towards the end of the war at all. So quite a testament to design that from 1939 through to 1945, that basic design was still very much state-of-the-art.
In Henry's logbook, he notes the planes that he has flown. And so, for example, on October the 3rd, he flies Spitfire VC.
Yeah, Mark 5C, tropical.
October 13, he's flying Mark 5B. And then on the 20th of October, he's flying Mark 5. So obviously they've got different aircraft types. Was that for different jobs or just same job, slightly different capability?
The marks sort of went in numerical order. So Mark 1 through to, I think, the final Spitfire round was a Mark 22. It wasn't quite consistent. I think they did that on purpose to make it hard for historians to try and follow each model. But certainly each model had a subtype, and it was generally like the Mark 5B had the B wing, which was two 20mm cannon and generally 4 30 caliber machine guns. It's because the British and the Germans had, when they were developing these fighters in the late 30s, the Germans thought, well, no, we want a combination of fast-firing machine guns and some cannon for hitting power, whereas the British thought, no, we reckon 8 machine guns grouped to converge at 250 yards would do the most damage. And they're probably right prior to self-sealing fuel tanks and armour for crew. As soon as, because in the Spanish Civil War, the Germans certainly realised pretty quickly that anything that didn't have any crew armour or self-sealing fuel tanks or armour for oil tanks and things like that, any of the vulnerable areas of the aircraft, were quite vulnerable. So they started putting armour in their aircraft pretty early. And the British soon found out they just had to close in and hammer away at these bombers to get any effect, essentially. And as the Germans put more and more armour in, the British then finally reluctantly said, yeah, we do need some of these heavy hitting cannons as well to get through the armour plate. The Mark 5 was they modified, I think there was a couple of maybe Mark 2 Spits towards the end of the Battle of Britain. They started putting the Hispano cannon in. It was a ship-based cannon, basically, and it was would freeze at altitude, prone to blockages. So it took them a while to fully develop the cannon, and then the Mark 5B was probably the first variant that had a fully effective cannon in it and the 4 machine guns. So they went from 8 machine guns to 2 cannon and 4 machine guns. And then the Mark 5C was with the B wing, but with the C's, it stands for tropical. I don't know why, but it had the big, what they call the Volks filter, VOLKES filter underneath. And if you Google Mark 5C, you'll see this big ugly nose on it. And that was for desert operations. The Merlin was basically a derivative of the R for race engines that the Rolls-Royce developed in the 30s for the Schneider Cup trophies. So it was quite an advanced engine for its day. V12, 4 valves per cylinder, double overhead cam, high revving motor geared down to propeller. So it was a gearbox to reduce the revs of the propeller doing, because the faster the propeller goes, the less efficient it is. So the gearbox had geared about half. So the engine, a normal Merlin in the Spitfires, Mustang, things like that, 3,000 engine RPM on takeoff, and the prop's doing about 1,600 roughly. So it's geared down. So then they developed the R, or the race engine, into the Rolls-Royce Merlin. So it was always a very finely built, not very strong. It was lightweight, finely built, very tight tolerances, so very susceptible to any dust and sand damage. So they found pretty early on they had to put these sand filters on the engines to give them any life, otherwise they'd wear out in 10 or 15 hours. Whereas the Allison engine, which was the American-developed engine that was sort of developed at the same time based on their race engines from the Schneider Cup Trophy, was a lot more robust engine, and the Kitty Hawks had it, and it could, it's like a tractor engine in comparison to the Merlin, which was always a bit more of a dainty race engine, highly tuned, but still a very good engine though. Yeah, so that was the Mark 5C. So Henry would have been flying, they might have had a batch of they might have had early Mark 5s, that might have still just had machine guns in the wings, they might have had the cannon variant and the type Mark 5C, obviously, which is a tropical variant that they were modifying for the Middle East ops.
Tell us about Henry's time in Malta and what you think this must have been like for him.
On the 31st of May, he wrote, "Told was posted overseas, packed kit and went down to dispersal, no airplane to take me to Skibray." By the time he had finished in Scotland, he'd accumulated about 260 hours of flying experience over the prior 12 months. So around that time was the Siege of Malta, and there is a number of great books. This is a great book about the Siege of Malta. As the Axis, as the Germans and the Italians in particular were moving south into Africa, the location of Malta was critical to that. And Malta was really a fortress that a number of people commented on, because what the people of Malta did was disrupt those supply lines for the Axis, moving people down into Africa. The Germans in particular had persistently tried to flatten it. The Allies had defended it very well, not without great loss.
Can you explain to us how he actually got to Malta?
So it started on June the 5th when he eventually left the Orkney Isles. He caught a train down to Liverpool. From Liverpool, he boarded the Empire Shackleton, which was a merchant ship, which eventually took them down to Gibraltar on the 30th of June. So that's some 18 days later. He attended a briefing where he was told he would be boarding HMS Eagle. He still wasn't sure at this point where they were going to, but I think it was becoming more and more apparent that they were heading to Malta. HMS Eagle was an aircraft carrier. This is Wednesday the 15th to Monday the 20th of July, 1942. As the assault on Malta cooled, stock could be taken. Since the beginning of the month, in just 2 weeks of concentrated fighting, the defenders had lost some 36 Spitfires, destroyed or badly damaged in action, with 3 more written off in accidents. This represented about 40% of all available fighters, with half as many again suffering damage of a lesser degree. Although losses of pilots, still much more plentiful than were the mounts for them, had been at much lower level, the rate of attrition of Spitfires was indeed severe. Help was on the way, however, for the carrier Eagle had sailed off Gibraltar with a deck cargo of 32 Spitfire Mark Vs to be flown on the dawn of Wednesday the 15th as Operation Pinpoint. It then goes on to say the first flight departed without an incident, but then one aircraft, EP-117, flown by Sergeant Bill Knox Williams, an Australian, crashed into the bridge on takeoff. Pilot was unhurt, but the damaged aircraft had to be pushed over the side to enable those following to take off. The remaining Spitfires arrived safely, flown in by a predominantly Commonwealth group of pilots, including a high proportion of Canadians. One Spitfire had clipped off its wingtip on a 6-inch gun mount on takeoff, although the pilot was able to control his aircraft and reach Malta without further event. He wrote, didn't sleep too well, was up at 4:30, rather excited. He had his breakfast and then was up on the flight deck, ready for takeoff at 5:45 a.m. And then he notes, I was 6 to go off. I had trouble getting the kite ready. Then at 6:15 a.m., my signal to go off. Jammed open the throttle, hoped for the best, just made it, although I sank down into the water. Tested the extra tank and found everything okay. Started out on the trip feeling fine. I had a few anxious moments passing Pantelleria, a tiny island in the Straits of Sicily in the Mediterranean, and eventually landed at Malta Lucca Air Base at 9:30 p.m.
The carrier was too valuable to dock, basically, with the German bombers and their air superiority trying to bomb Malta into submission. In fact, Malta is the only country ever to win a George Cross or a George Medal, the only country to ever win a bravery award. And so that's why they would send the Spitfires off early outside the range of the long-range German bombers. Yeah, they had to, and it says in the, I think it said in the note here somewhere, they had to have 32 knots of wind across the deck.
Wind over deck, 31 knots, leaving 2 kilometre margin.
Yeah, that would be probably, I would say, 2-knot margin. So in other words, if they had 29 knots or below, they would crash. So they had a 2-knot margin over their because an aeroplane's got a stall speed and a Spitfire's about 65 knots it'll get airborne at. So if you've got 32 knots or 30 knots already over the deck, you only have to accelerate another 30 knots and you're airborne because you've got 60 knots of airspeed because you've already got 30 that the ship's giving you. So that's why aircraft carriers are always steam far and point into wind when they're launching and recovering aircraft because the wind speed over the deck is as much as they can achieve, which gives a shorter takeoff run and a shorter landing run, especially in the Second World War. With catapults and arresting gear now is probably not so much of an issue.
So it would have been, pretty precarious situation for these young men.
Oh, yes.
Just incredible stories of bravery. And John and I have talked about this a lot. It's just so hard to believe these were young men, 21, 22, maybe 23 years old, doing these incredible things.
Oh, and if that, a lot of them are even younger than that, but they wouldn't have been able to recover back on the ship because they didn't have a hook. So if they had any issues, they were either at the ditch, but at least there probably, unless there was U-boats in the area, they probably would have been picked up. But yeah, and if you were first in line, like so with the aircraft all stacked up on the deck with their engines running, of course the first aircraft that go off have a shorter distance. So if he's number 6, he would have been in the group probably that had the less distance, if you like, as the more that took off in front of you, the more room you got on the aircraft carrier. They weren't down in the holds. They were all just stacked and lashed down on the decks with their engine running all squeezed up against each other to give the guys in the front the max distance. A bit like the Doolittle Raiders with the B-25s. You know, the first 1 or 2 to get off were really short on distance because they had less distance, basically. So being number 6, they probably would have, I'm not sure how they would have organised that, whether it was you drew the straws as to when you go or maybe on ability or experience. Maybe ability, experience. So the fact he went number 6 shows that he was a pretty competent sort of operator and pretty groovy. You know, when you look at him there in the photo with his big tuft of blonde hair and all that, he was very much the fighter pilot, wasn't he?
He really was.
Can you speak about once on Malta, what sort of activities was he doing? And can you tell us about when he was shot down?
So once he had arrived in Malta, so he had joined number 126 Squadron in Lucca, Malta on July 18th. He did his very first scramble, which he notes as being 25 minutes long. And when I look at all of his entries for all of the flights that he did, they're all quite short, 10 minutes, 25 minutes. I mean, there are a couple of exceptions when they flew for an hour, but a lot of them were up and down, you know. Interestingly, on that July 18th one, he scrambled, I'm assuming with others, and he notes that enemy aircraft turned back. So they obviously intercepted enemy aircraft, but the enemy aircraft chose not to engage. So on the 8th of September, was scrambled. He was in the air for 35 minutes, but he actually was shot down. And there's a very interesting reference in the reference book. It notes Tuesday, 8th of September. The second week of the new month was unusually quiet and relatively uneventful for Malta's defences. Only the occasional offensive reconnaissance sorties by small groups of high-flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s causing alarm. Although on the morning of the 8th, 2 Messerschmitts 77s bounced a section of 126 Squadron, and Sgt Henry Roberts was shot down by Oberlieutenant Gieshart. He bailed out and came down in the sea off Benghazi Point. High-speed launch 128 set out before Roberts hit the sea, and he was in the water for only 4 minutes before being picked up. The delighted New Zealander commented to his rescue as they fished him out, "A little bit sooner, you could have caught me on the deck and saved me getting with this wet." Yeah, so Gieshart was born in the same year as Henry and eventually died in 1943, so a year after Henry. Was a Luftwaffe fighter ace who is credited with 102 victories out of 642 combat missions. At least 17 of those are accredited against the Spitfire. So him shooting Henry down, that would have been one of the 17 kills that Gieshart registered.
Very successful. And a lot of those guys, the aces in the Middle East and everything, flying against quite good quality Australian pilots, British pilots, New Zealanders, Canadians. The Germans who racked up the kills there were probably more admired, if you like, by the buffs now than Eric Hartmann, who got most of his kills on the Eastern Front by poorly trained Russian pilots just flying in a straight line. Hans Joachim Marseille is one of my heroes, if you like, of the Luftwaffe for the Second World War. He flew in the Middle East. He wasn't ever in Sicily, though, I don't think. Would have been interesting if he came up against Henry at some stage about that time. And he ended up dying because his engine failed and he bailed out at low level trying to get back to friendly lines and hit the tail. And he got knocked out. He died when he hit the ground, of course. But he was an expert shot with this deflection shooting. Gieshart, it sounds like he would have been a pretty good operator, and he was shot down. So it'd be interesting to know whether it must have hit his engine or something like that, but he wasn't injured. But bailing out of a Spitfire is not that easy. They're very tight little cockpit on them. Yeah, the preferred bailout technique, if you could, is to jettison the canopy, undo your harness and your oxygen lead, roll inverted, and then just let go of the stick, and then you fall clear.
Wow.
Yeah. Because otherwise they're quite hard to get out of, actually. And a lot of them, if they had a wing shot off and the high G and you have the thing spiralling, just couldn't get out because of the G, and they just ride it in even if they weren't injured.
Well, so you had to sort of almost push yourself out. There was no ejector seat or anything like that.
No, not a manual bailout. No, very difficult to bail out of once you got high speed. Very hard to get out past the slipstream over your canopy. So a lot of pilots would have gone in Spits, probably be not injured, but just couldn't get out. That's why ejection seats were brought in. And the Germans actually were trialling ejection seats in some of their loader fighter aircraft towards the end of the Second World War. And I mean, the T-28 Trojan, which is a 60s era trainer, there's a note in the book saying anything manual bailouts above 200 knots, highly unlikely to be successful. So they put an early version of an ejection seat in that aeroplane so that people could get out. But in a controlled bailout, no problem. But yeah, if you got bits missing, you had to be pretty quick. 6 months, yeah. So it would have been pretty tough. They would have been, air raids around the clock. The Germans would try and keep them awake, of course, to fatigue them so they couldn't sleep. And so there'd be nuisance raids at night and things like that to break their sleep. So there was a whole campaign to try and break that island down. How many missions did he fly?
So let's say he did, somewhere between 80 and 100 missions.
Yeah, and some of them would have been 2 or 3 in a day. So interesting, in reading those in various dogfights as well, obviously.
Yeah, well, this one interesting, October 28th, Spitfire, version 5C, patrol, jumped by 2 109s and one, is it a Macchini?
Oh, Macchi C202.
Yeah, well, it just says, and one Macchi. Had a squirt at 109, no result. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's
so good on him. He's up there just firing away,
Oh yeah. Well, they probably came through firing and kept going, which a lot of them did because they knew they couldn't turn with the Spit, so they would just try a firing pass and keep going home. So he's probably just fired long range after. Once they come zotting through, they obviously bounced and got him by surprise. As they're saying, 80% of people were shot down without even seeing who shot you down. So they're probably lucky to get away with that one. Yeah, fascinating stuff. But no, I'd say he was obviously quite a capable pilot to go straight on the fighters, number 6 off the carrier. He certainly was keen to get in amongst it.
Again, it's been very interesting thinking about that. Here I am researching a family member and in awe of Henry's service, ultimately giving his life to service for all of us. But on the other side of this dreadful war was another young man born in the same year, died 6 months later after Henry died. And so there's sort of this odd feeling that certainly I have. That's just another young man from another part of the world who ended up on the other side of the war, but again, ultimately, paid the ultimate with his life.
When you look at it like that, it's actually quite frightening, that whole futility of war.
It really is.
No one ever wins.
That's exactly right, John. 2 young men who eventually end up in the skies above Malta, both away from their hometowns. That really does highlight the futility of war. And both young men die within 6 months of each other. Just that sort of really, for me, helps encapsulate the pointlessness of war.
But no, certainly the Mark V at that time was a very, still very, very much a frontline fighter. The 109G variant of the Messerschmitt was very much an equal adversary for it, but it was certainly in the right hands. A Mark V was very much capable of holding its own. But if you come up against, an ace like that, you got to be really on your game to get away with it because they know all the tricks in the book.
Well, it's an amazing story, and you mentioned it earlier about how Malta was given a George Cross. Just shows you, the significance of Malta in terms of that position in the Mediterranean and serving North Africa.
It was very important. Well, Churchill described it as the unsinkable aircraft carrier. And, strategically, if the Germans had bombed it in submission and invaded, then they would have had a secure port a lot closer to North Africa to supply Rommel, because that was one of the big issues towards the end when Montgomery was pushing Rommel back, was Rommel just couldn't get supplies. Because by then with Malta and long-ranging Beaufighter squadrons and things like that, they shoot down a lot of the German transport aircraft flying supplies down. In fact, I think there's one case where there was something like 30 Junker 52s were flying down on the deck, early one morning. They bounced by a whole number of Beaufighters, and I think there was something like 25 of them shot down, full of troops, and it wouldn't have been pretty. But no, certainly the Spitfire to fly is, it's an interesting thing compared to the Mustang, which was developed, first flew in 1941, and you can tell the difference between the two. That the Spitfire first flew, as I was saying before, straight out of the biplane era, so it has a lot of what's called adverse yaw. So if you apply aileron, which is the roll control, you've got one surface going up on one wing and the other one going down on the other wing. That creates lift on one wing and dumps lift on the other, so you actually end up rolling. But that aileron that goes down is in denser air because the air under the wing is denser than the air on top. And so it creates adverse yaw. So if you put on left aileron to roll left, the right aileron goes down. And actually, in the Spitfire's case, yaws the nose door away from the direction you want to turn. So to combat that, you use rudder. So you've got to use a fair bit of rudder. As you put in aileron, you use rudder at the same time so that the aeroplane will roll about the point you can go into a turn. Otherwise, as you're rolling left, the nose will go out to the right before you start turning. Very much like the early biplanes, but that's some of the appeal of the Spitfire is you need to use both controls to fly the aeroplane in a coordinated manner. Whereas later fighters like the Mustang, they designed that out of it by putting differential ailerons in it, gap sealing them and all that sort of stuff.
Is it a difficult plane to fly, the Spitfire?
No, once airborne, absolute delight. It's got great stall warning. It gives you a really good indication that you're close to the stall. So if you're pulling the stick back to try and turn, the wing's producing more and more lift to the point where the airflow starts separating over the top of the wing. It won't sort of adhere to the top of the wing anymore. So then you start getting turbulence over the tailplane. And that's when you know you're flying right on the edge of the max lift capability of the airplane. So it really talks to you like that. On the ground, yes, they are lack of visibility. They don't like crosswinds. But when they were first designed, the British just had all over grass fields, 1 mile boundary grass fields, and they just push all the Spitfires over in one big row in the morning, pointing in the wind. And if they scramble, they just all take off together as 12 aircraft all line abreast and get airborne together in one big go. So, and they'd come in and land into wind as well over this big square grass field, and they'd have dispersal points and things like that. So crosswinds were only really invented when they started putting asphalt runways in. And we limit the Spitty to about 10 to 12 knots of crosswind. So they can be a bit tricky there. The earlier variant, not so much, but the later variants, that I fly, the Mark 8 and the Mark 16, with the bigger version of the Merlin compared to what Henry flew, has a 4-bladed propeller, and they never change the size of the undercarriage. So you got to be very careful on takeoff. You don't let the tail come up too much because the prop will hit the ground. There's a classic case of when the Focke-Wulf 190 came out and started outperforming the Mark 5s. I thought, shit, because they'd already had on the drawing board a Mark 9 with a bigger Merlin engine. So they thought, no, we better do this quickly. So they put these bigger Merlins straight into Mark 5s on the production line and thought, right, where are we up to? We've got the Mark 8 on the drawing board. We'll call it a Mark 9 now. So it's basically a Mark 5 with a bigger engine in it. With that, they had to put a 4-bladed prop on it to absorb the horsepower. And then, of course, you start having issues with ground clearance because they never properly designed it to have that prop on it in the first place because it was in time of war and let's just get the engines in and get them out there. But that ended up probably becoming the most successful variant of the Spitfire, the one most loved by pilots for its all-round performance was the Mark 9. Which was a Mark 5 like Henry flew, but with a bigger engine, probably an extra 500 horsepower.
As a young pilot taking like a Spitfire, what would have been his biggest challenges?
Probably the nerves, before some of the mission. A lot of pilots, depends. Some pilots are different. Some would be very nervous to the point of vomiting prior to strapping into their aircraft, prior to takeoff on there. And even pilots that were quite experienced and had a number of missions under their belts, like 15, 20 missions, they would still nervously vomit before they hopped in the airplane, knowing that they were basically, after seeing other aircraft shot down, it was really a roll of the dice, really. So the main concern probably for initially the pilots, they would have been told to stick to the leader's wing or stick on my wing. To more experienced pilots say, stick on my wing, you protect my tail, just stick with me. I don't want you to do anything else. Just stick with me and keep an eye on my tail to make sure no one's sneaking up on me. So, but in the middle of a dogfight, if that pilot's really aggressively manoeuvring, it'd be very easy to shake an inexperienced pilot off and all of a sudden they're on their own. And they always said rule number one in any combat, never be by yourself because you can't see everywhere at once. So you always need 2 sets of eyes and at least the minimum of a pair. So early on and that leg shaking example I was using was a number of cases of a number of books I've read over the years of Spitfire pilots and even bomber pilots and things like that. And crewmen, once they got close to battle, if there was aircraft coming in or if they were in a dogfight, they'd be turning, trying to get on another guy's tail, or he'd be trying to get on his tail, and his legs would just be shaking because they could see him gaining on him and thought, well, there's only going to be one result out of this. Obviously, just the fear about the die. And then they'd do that 2 or 3 times a day, during the Battle of Britain, which is why a lot of them were physically and mentally exhausted by the end of it. But other pilots, they said, I was nervous before going flying, but as soon as I was in the airplane, all the nerves went away.
And then you also spoke about flying in a straight line. You're up and fly. What should the guy be doing? How often should he be looking behind him?
Yes, so they said you should be S-ing or continually. You should never fly in a straight line for more than 30 seconds was the rule of thumb. Because if an aircraft was bouncing you out of the sun, if you're in a straight line, it was very easier for him to work out how far ahead of you to shoot or come in behind you if you wanted a zero deflection shot straight up behind you and in your blind spot, which is down under your tail. So if you're turning every 30 seconds and looking behind, you're clearing your tail because that's basically your blind spot. Now, they had rear view mirrors on the canopy, but they're not very effective. So you really have to have your head on a swivel, which is why a lot of pilots ditch the top button being done up with the tie very quickly, or a scarf, a silk scarf, because they'd end up with chafing around the neck from the starched collars. So that's where the scarf sort of... in World War I, they had the scarf so they could wipe the paraffin oil off their goggles because of the oil coming out of the rotary engines. But World War II, they tended to wear the scarves so they didn't get chafed around the necks. And plus, I think it made them look a bit cooler too. They were the dashing fighter pilot with their scarves. I think only 5% of pilots ever became aces. So to become an ace, you had to shoot down 5 aircraft, confirmed by a independent witness, and only less than 5% that served in the Second World War became aces. So they either had the brain space to absorb what was going on around them quicker, learn, adapt to situations, good shots. There were some very good pilots that flew throughout the war and survived for 3 or 4 years, never hit another aircraft, but they blazed away at a whole lot of them. But they were good wingmen, they were good to be in the air, and they would scare a lot of aircraft away, or they would get on tails, but just never hit them because they were not very good shots. So you had to be a good deflection shooter because once it turned into a turning fight, you're aiming ahead of the other aircraft. So the early gun sights became irrelevant. So it really came down to assessment of lead, gravity, drop, and so getting as close as you possibly could to the target gave you less chance of missing them. So the really good guys were getting really, really close. And in fact, during the Battle of Britain, I think the guns were originally harmonised to converge. So the 8 Brownings converged to 350 yards, so they don't become balls, so they do max damage. And the Aces would have that brought down to 150 yards, so that they would get in a whole lot closer, and the bullets would be still going faster and do a lot more damage than at 350 yards when they would have slowed down a fair bit more. Yeah, so getting in close was what set apart the average pilots to the Aces, I think, and the ones that were aggressive, the ones that wanted to get out there and get into it. We didn't have that fear. I mean, Chuck Yeager was a classic when he shot down 5 109s in one day, and his CO chastised him because he went off by himself ahead of the squadron. And they said, well, you didn't stick with the squadron. You could have got yourself shot down. Why'd you do that? And he said, there wasn't enough to go around. So he went out and took them on himself. So there's a fellow that was fairly full of himself, which is probably why they encourage that. In fact, fighter pilots nowadays, you got to have confidence in your ability. You got to think you're better than the guy that you're taking on. Otherwise, and that's how they're still trained to this day, that you got to have that knowledge that you are better.
And then, Guy, in Malta, they came up against Me-109s and some Italian aircraft. Can you tell us a little bit about those aircraft?
Yeah, well, the 109 and the Spitfire were basically developed around about the same time, just towards the end of the biplane era. The Messerschmitt first flew in, I think it was December 1935, the Spitfire March 1936. Very revolutionary for their time. Low wing, all stress skin construction, retractable undercarriage, sliding canopies, heavily armed, but very small aircraft built around these big engines for performance. And they were both developed right throughout the war. The Spitfire probably more successfully towards the end. The German, the 109, became very heavy towards the end of the war because it put a lot of cannon thing on them to try and shoot down the B-17s, etc. But they weren't as effective. But certainly 1941, around when Henry was flying, he was flying a Mark V, which was a very good variant of the Spitfire. In fact, the people nowadays fly Spitfires for fun. They reckon the Mark V is the sweetest handling out of the lot, but the Mark IX is the best performer as far as the all-round dogfighting platform. But so Henry was flying a Mark V up against 109Gs, so they were very similar in performance. Where the 109 had the advantage, certainly in the Battle of Britain, was that it had a much quicker roll rate, so it could roll quicker, so it could actually change direction faster than the Spitfire, and it also had a fuel-injected engine, so it could bunt, so it could push the nose down very quickly. If the Spitfire came up behind the tail, it could push the nose down. And the early Spitfires had a carburetted engine, so if they pushed and went to negative G, the engine would stop. And plus the Spitfire was a very slow rolling aeroplane with the early variants before they modified the wings with the metal ailerons so that it could roll quicker. So 109, all you have to do was bump and you'd be away by the time. And what the Spitfires would have to try and do would be to roll, keep positive G, and then pull down to keep the engine running. And by that time, the 109 got away. So they could out-climb the early model Spitfire. They could out-dive it, but they couldn't out-turn it. So you could always out-turn a 109, providing you use the full capability of the Spitfire and pull to what we call the buffet. So you pull to where the airflow over the wing starting to separate. So you're asking the most of the wing for the air going over the top of it, and you'll start getting some separation, which will then hit your tailplane. You start getting this vibration for your stick. You know, okay, that's as far as I can go. And if you hold a spit there, yeah, you could always outturn the 109. So most of the attacks the 109s try and do would be the benefit of height and just dive down through the squadron, through the Spitfire squadron, firing as they went, and then they just keep going and then climb back up and then come back around and try it again. Very rarely would they go into a turning fight with a Spitfire because that wasn't going to end up well for them.
And in terms of the Italian planes?
Italian planes are very good, actually. The Macchi C200 and the 202, I don't know a whole lot about them, but they're a beautiful-looking aeroplane. The Italian pilots were very, very good stick and rudder pilots. Like, they prided themselves on their air show routine, their aerobatics and things like that. But and some of them were quite good dogfighters. I think their pilot quality wasn't as good as maybe the British or the Germans in some way. They weren't as aggressive. But certainly their aircraft in the right hands, the Macchi 202 especially, was equal in a lot of ways to the Spitfire. In fact, probably even slightly better in some areas. Generally, it wasn't. It didn't give the British, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans too much trouble because any sort of numbers, or if the Spits are aggressive, they tend to run away and go for home, a lot of them, but with the benefit advantage of height, etc. And they were also seen to be doing beautiful aerobatics like loops and rolls in the middle of a dogfight, thinking that they were a hard target, but they weren't because they were predictable. So they were easily shot down as well. Main thing, if you've got someone on your tail, last thing you want to be is predictable. You put the stick in all various corners of the cockpit, rudder as well, so you're slipping and skidding, jolting and jinking, so that you're an unpredictable target. Whereas if you're doing a nice slow roll, thinking, well, this is going to look good, and they won't be able to shoot me down, that's actually incorrect.
And then for a young pilot just arriving on Malta, did he have a good chance of success?
Look, it was round-the-clock bombing by the Germans, trying to break down infrastructure in Malta, hit all the supply ships that were coming in. A number of cases of convoys a lot of them were nearly wiped out, and only 2 or 3 20-odd ships would make it into the harbour there. There was a USS Ohio, I think it was, that managed to limp in only just, and it was full of aviation fuel. And if that hadn't have made it, they basically had no fuel left. And the Germans could have invaded very easily because the British or the Malta wouldn't have had any air cover. But early on, though, all they had was 3 obsolete Glossy Gladiators that were quickly assembled there out of crates, and they nicknamed them Faith, Hope and Charity. Those guys probably didn't fancy their chances that much. But as soon as the Spitfire started arriving, I think the guys would have been pretty confident that they could take the fight to the Germans and do very well. But the conditions on the ground were very tough. Food was scarce. Accommodation was scarce. They were always living in bomb shelters and things like that. The aircraft were quickly rearmed and refueled each time they came in because they were less vulnerable in the air than on the ground, because they didn't want to lose them on the ground, of course. So the rate of the tempo of the operations there would have been pretty high. A true fighter pilot would have loved it, thinking, great, this is fantastic. There's plenty of action. There's plenty of pickings. Let's go out and get them. But I think it certainly would have been pretty tough on the ground for them with the conditions that they were facing.
So towards the end of 1942, Henry would write a letter home and complete his last convoy escort. Can you share with us his letter and tell us about his flight?
So, yes, there is a letter we have, which is a beautiful letter, which he wrote to his mother on the 12th of November, 1942. Henry dies on the 19th of November, 1942. So it's a very poignant letter. But I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs because it brings to light the sadness of Henry's ultimate death. So he writes, "Dear Mother, just another page or so to let you know that I'm still alive and kicking. I haven't anything interesting to say at the moment. Anyway, it will fill in a couple of hours. There are no good shows on tonight, at least I have seen them all, so I'm spending a night at home. In fact, I've been here all day reading and messing about. At the moment, I have been reading through some previous letters to see if I can find anything to write about. The last I received was posted on the 14th of May, 1942, so you see how we stand as regards to mail at the present moment. I'm waiting to hear from you so that I can find out where Frank and Graham are. So when I go back to England, I'll be able to look them up. I hope to be leaving at the end of the month. Judging by all the parcels you have sent through, they should keep me well stocked for a few months. One thing, though, I will be back in England for another winter, which I'm not looking forward to after all the hot weather we get here. Anyway, can't have everything. This time last year, I was in Montreal, Canada, if I remember correctly. On leave at the time, I was a sprog sergeant showing off a pair of wings and thought I could fly an aeroplane. And now look at me. I feel as though I am one of the old hands at the game. I remember first arriving in London and meeting chaps who had seen air ops and feeling as though I would like to sink through the floor when they started shooting a line about their different experiences. This time, it will be me who will be able to shoot the line. On reading through that last paragraph, you probably wonder what a few of those expressions mean. I suppose also, in some of my previous letters, there would have been a few words we use all the time, which you have to find out what they stand for. Well, in the RAF, they seem to have a different language when talking about flying and things connected with it. For a start, I mentioned sprog, which only means somebody new, and then shooting a line, telling someone some experience and making it sound a pretty daring sort of job. There are more. Bags equals plenty. Browned off equals fed up, and so on. Probably it would take a couple of pages to tell them all. Anyway, if any future mail you see such an expression and can't understand them, you will know it's just RAF language. Well, I feel much better now. Just been down for supper, consisting of soup, beans and meat and rice, because he says I can get breakfast. There is no going out to a restaurant and paying for a meal like the good old days. There doesn't seem much news these days about the Japs. One thing, they don't seem to be able to reach New Zealand yet. It looks as though the Australians gave them something to think about in New Guinea, by the news that is. Taking the war situation all around, things seem to be looking pretty rosy for all the Allies. Let's hope they continue that way. Rommel has got something to think about in the Middle East, what with the 8th Army pushing him back and the Americans starting in North Africa. In another 6 months, if it keeps up like the present, it should be about the beginning of the end, I hope, in brackets. How are all the children getting on? Growing up, I suppose. Are there any additions since I have been away? Tell Carol, who is my mother-in-law, who was the youngest, I haven't forgotten her birthday on the 1st of December. So that again, that's why this letter is so meaningful to my mother-in-law. As time is getting on, and I reckon I have done a good job in writing all of this, so we'll leave it at that for the moment. So until a few more days, remember me to all the relations, etc. Your loving son, Henry. And that was the last communication from Henry, which, as I say, was 7 days before he ultimately died. So on the 19th of November, there is no entry for this, but Henry and a number of other planes went out to provide air cover to a military convoy of ships. During that effort, which involved both Spitfires and bombers, a number of planes ended up in the water. Ultimately, Henry ended up in the water. A couple of recollections, or a couple of accounts, should I say. One was that Henry was spotted in the water. The other one says he was in a life raft. But either way, Henry didn't come back from that. So it appears on the face of it that Henry had some problem with his plane, given there was no enemy aircraft in the area. Ended up either bailing out or flying into the sea.
The general impression was that he was last seen in his life raft, which is true, but it looks like he wasn't picked up. He wasn't the one found dead in the raft.
Well, yeah, the way I read it, he would have drowned ultimately, I guess.
Yeah, he was seen in his raft.
He just wasn't picked up, and that was the end.
Obviously, they got to a couple of others that had parachuted into the water, and the pilot officer Park, 185 Squadron, suffered engine trouble near the convoy and had to bail out. And then the destroyer sped to his rescue, but he's found to be already dead. So obviously, he didn't get into his raft, or occasionally if they didn't release their parachute early enough and some were told to release it just prior to hitting the water, it could drag them under, especially if they're still in their full flying kit.
It sounds as if the weather on the day was not the greatest, so it may have been hard to spot him, a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, he was last seen in his dinghy near the convoy. So he actually got into his dinghy, and you got to feel a bit sorry for him seeing the ships just keep going. He would have been hoping for rescue over the next few days, obviously. But, so there'll be a number of cases like that of aircraft just never returning. You know, they were on radio silence, they had issues and they had to ditch, and they still don't know what happened to a lot of crews. And there could have been stories of people sitting in rafts for days waiting for rescue, ultimately to drown, like you say, or die of exposure. But, so there's a lot of cases like that around the Mediterranean, actually, during the war. Because that was quite often, if there's a U-boat, they didn't slow up. They thought, well, we're not going to lose a ship to pick up one pilot and be a stationary target. Sorry, mate. And classic case of that was these are some of the bravest guys, I reckon, in the Second World War, were the ferry swordfish pilot flying an open cockpit biplane on the Arctic patrols, where they used to, under the Lend-Lease deal, the British would supply a lot of aircraft and equipment to Russia early on in the war. So they had these these convoys who would go up over the Arctic Circle and up around the top and try and get in to Vladivostok or something like that up there, I think. And of course, the Germans' long-range bomber aircraft, the ULKAS 88s and things, would be stationed to try and get them. So, and the U-boats were sent out there. So they had these ferry swordfish who were basically patrolling. They had rockets and torpedoes patrolling against U-boats in minus 20-degree conditions, ice and snow on the aircraft carrier, radio silence, taking off for a 2-hour patrol. A lot of them never saw again. And there was one case of what they do, they give the pilot, just before he took off, say, righto, this is the ship's course and speed, and in 15 minutes we're going to turn right 30 degrees, because they always zigzag, so they were a less predictable shot for a U-boat. And then the navigator would sort of put this into his this sort of manual computer, and he'd go, righto, after 2 hours, this is what the ship's done. If I now steer this heading, I should find it with radio silence. But of course, if the ship didn't do that, or it did something else, or it ran into U-boats, then the swordfish would come back and go, right, where are they? And radio silence, they couldn't radio, and they would just run out of fuel and die.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
And there was one case of they actually see the swordfish coming up behind the carrier. They only used to fly at 90 knots and ran out of fuel and ditched about a mile behind. They just said, sorry, we'll just have to keep going because there were U-boats in the area. So these guys just perished. But imagine that. Very sad that he met his end the way he did. I'm sure he would have preferred to have gone down in a ball of fire rather than sort of sitting in a raft waiting to get picked up.
Well, that's helpful insight, Guy, about if there'd been U-boats in the area, the ships would have just, kept on steaming.
Yes, or they came back to find him, and in the sea state that it was, couldn't find him. He was last seen, and they thought, right, let's go back and get him now. They might have just dispatched that one destroyer to pick up the other one under parachute. They saw him go into the water. Right, there's Henry over there, no worries. We'll come back and get him on the way back, and just couldn't find him. He might have been waving madly, I'm over here now, sort of thing.
They wouldn't have had high vis.
No, they would have had singling mirrors and things like that, but it was bad weather. The sun wouldn't have helped.
So, Steve, Henry has a remembrance plaque in Malta. Are you able to tell us about the memorial?
So the Malta Memorial is dedicated to the 2,298 Commonwealth air crew who lost their lives in various Second World War air battles and engagements around the Mediterranean, and who have no known grave. It's a beautiful memorial, a very tall pillar, and around the base of it are brass plaques with the names of the different people who served with the different air forces. So it's a fabulous monument. And the panels themselves bear the inscription, over these and neighbouring lands and seas, the airmen whose names are recorded here fell in raid or sortie and have no known grave. There's a piece of Latin on there as well, which translates to an island resolute of purpose remembers resolute men, which is just a wonderful thing. I think, Matt, to your question about why is it important to tell this story? Well, I think for our family, this is an important story to bring to life. I don't believe Henry's story was that well known in the family, but back in that era, the young men who went to war, and again, in Henry's particular case, came out of a ballot. Now, at the time, there were 1.6 million people in New Zealand, and from memory, about 380,000 people's names came out of the ballot. So, that's just the way life went for Henry. But I think also more broadly for the Anzacs and for in general, it is just, we often hear some of the stories about, the servicemen who did acts of amazing bravery, but there are all these stories like Henry's who never get told, and they may not even be known within their family. For every one of these stories, there are dozens and dozens of other incredible stories.
I really think it's an amazing story. And when you think of Henry could have been anybody. Very fortunate for you, Steve. Henry is part of your family. But Henry represents a person who, going about life, just had a future ahead of him in New Zealand. There's a war that's raging at the other side of the world. So Henry, through a ballot, is taken from his life. He doesn't begrudge what he's doing because he's got this amazing adventure. He's a sergeant flying what was a state-of-the-art aeroplane at the time. It's assigned a brand new Spitfire with this amazing technology. Goes across, has the Canadian adventure, then gets sent over to the Shetland Islands, and then straight away he's in defence mode. So you've got the attacking Axis powers flying in from the north. So the hours that he actually the flying hours were incredible. No wonder he was then identified as a high potential that could go down to Malta and fly escort missions and also be a part of the operation in Malta. And that's where Henry's story is amazing, because he's picked up this technology at the time so quickly in a situation where it is life and death. Heated death where he got shot down, and unfortunately he had an untimely end in 1942 in a situation where you had inclement weather and potentially a breakdown in the technology and sadly it wasn't able to be recovered. So, and these are all the sliding door moments in life, which I think it is so great for you to tell Henry's story.
You said it so powerfully, and I think that's why Anzac Day is such an important event. Keeps these stories alive, and as we discover more and more of these types of stories, hopefully that will just continue to contribute to the power of Anzac Day.
And we'll start a squadron, remuster 100 Squadron, because it's the 100th anniversary of the RAAF. So we're the only force in the world with a dedicated heritage squadron. So we've got a CO, XOs, OPSOs, flight commanders, and they brought us in as flight lieutenants. They thought, what are we going to do with all you old blokes that fly this stuff? And some of them are ex-military that fly the jets that are there, but and I fly the Meteor as well, but they made us flight lieutenants in the Air Force. But we're coming under this rank called a special capability officer. So essentially, if you've got a capability that they want, they can basically go, right, you're now in the military now. And here's a Bible, here's a portrait of the Queen. So help me God, you're now in the military. Yeah, so if you look at Temora Aviation Museum, there's a website, and it gives all the list of days that we have our flying days and things. So we're still operating as the Temora Aviation Museum, and we have our showcase days, and you'll see the showcase dates and things like that. And plus, we're also doing a lot of fly pasts and things for 100 Squadron as well. Yeah, so Temora is about an hour northwest of Wagga in central New South Wales, and he started acquiring a lot of aircraft, so he ended up getting Colpay's Spitfire Mark 8, Mark 16 Spitfire, which is essentially a Mark 9, but with a Packard-built Merlin. So because the Americans started making the Merlin during the war because the Poms couldn't keep up with production, and once they put the Merlin in the Mustang and transformed that aircraft, then Packard started building them under license. So again, getting back to the Spitfire thing, where the Mark 9, I said, right, we'll run out of Rolls-Royce engines, we're going to put the American one in now. So rather than calling it a Mark 9P for Packard, they're going, well, what are we up to? Oh, we're up to 16. We'll call it a 16. So just to confuse us even more, you go, 16, hang on. And so then the first Griffin-powered variant of the Spitfire, which had the bigger Merlin called a Griffin, Rolls-Royce Griffin engine, was a Mark 14. So that confuses people even more, because when I say, we got a Mark 16, they go, you got a Griffin engine. You go, no. I go, yeah, because the 14 was you go, no, but it's actually a Mark 9 with a Packard.
We will now play the last post. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.